Good morning, everyone.
Good
While
morning.
you're getting settled in here, I'm Amy Wyant. I'm from the Otsego County Conservation Association, and I'm here this morning to make sure we've got some of our tech shenanigans set. So as you're getting settled, if during the presentation you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A portion of the Zoom chat today. We also, at the very end, should have a few moments where we can open up for if anybody wants to ask their questions live. We can open up your microphone to be able to talk. So when we get to that point, we'll have you use the little raise hand and we will open up microphones. But with no further ado, it's now 9:30. So I'm going to turn it over to Troy Bishop to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Amy. Good morning, everybody. My pleasure to represent the Upper Susquehanna Coalition. I'm on a team of the outreach team that helps put this on, and I'm really happy to introduce you to Joe Graney. We just learned that Joe was raised on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, but not just raised, like he milks cows. So he knows about hard work. Apparently he likes picking, he enjoyed picking rocks more than milking cows. And that brought him into the professor of, geologic sciences, environmental studies at BU. I've had the pleasure to know Joe enough to have him show me around, taking a tour of the green infrastructure projects that he's going to talk about today. And I'm anxious to hear about how they're holding up with all our rain. So without further ado, let's welcome Joe Graney. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you, Troy, for that great introduction. So as Troy mentioned, this came about through a long-term friendship, I might say, with all my colleagues from the USC that I worked with for over 20 years now. Kind of interesting. And this, you might say this talk today was in a way inspired by a watershed tour we had at the Binghamton University campus back in the Watershed Forum back in the fall of 2019. So this is just a little offshoot from that tour. Okay, so with that, I'm going to share my screen today and get going here. All right, so great. Okay, so as Troy mentioned, this is a Watershed Wednesday, so I'm a professor of geological sciences and environmental studies. This talk is more about some work I do at the Center for Integrated Watershed Studies at Binghamton. So I'll start with just a little watershed overview here, and hopefully on your screen, you'll be able to see kind of the caption underneath the figures I'm going to be using today. Okay, so Binghamton University is located just downstream from the confluence of the Susquehanna and the Shenango rivers in Vestal, New York. This is an outline of the Fuller Hollow Creek Watershed that was created with stream stats. And on this, you can see Fuller Hollow Creek running through about the center of this watershed. All right, so the left screen is stream stats, and it turns out I also wanted to show you the 1961 Usgs Topographic Survey, which is how the Usgs determined the outline for the watershed, but also kind of shows just when campus started and associated with the construction of a campus, they straightened out Fuller Hollow Creek so they could start building these subdivisions. All right, well, that caused a few problems, and it still is today. So here's the bigger picture concern number one. It's going to be erosion. All right, so I slide this down again so you can see the entire caption. All right, so we straightened out Fuller Hollow Creek. It caused a lot of bed load to be deposited into the Susquehanna River. And unfortunately, the Fuller Hollow Creek exit point is right adjacent to the Binghamton Johnson City sewage treatment plant. And this large delta that has been forming, this is actually a photo from 2017 when it was a little bit drier than it was this year. You can see how that kind of impeded the flow of the Susquehanna River. And unfortunately, there's sewage effluent pipes located about right here, right in the middle of the delta. And so the New York State DOC has had some problems trying to keep this gravel out of here during the renovation of the plant. Now, also in 2017, then right across from this is where BU is located. This was actually the ITC building where the Watershed Forum was held. Right across from that is are new constructed wetlands, what we call the Bartle Wetlands. And so this is actually a parking lot today. And adjacent to that parking lot, this kind of rectangular structure that's about the size of a soccer or football field, that is the new Bartle Wetland site that we'll be talking about today. All right, so our second problem then, besides the erosion, which would be a water quantity problem, is we have a water quality problem as well. And so we've been trying to characterize that over a series of years with these green infrastructure projects. I'm going to slide this up a little bit now so you can see what we've been trying to do on campus. So once again, on the left-hand side here, we have an image that has an outline of all the sub-basins of the Fuller Hollow Creek Watershed. Right, so we have what we call the nature reserve, which we'll be talking about today, which is where major ponds and other activities are occurring. Basically has no urban impact, basically. It's basically forest. To the north of that, as Fuller Hollow Creek moves from the south towards the north, we have campus itself, which has lots of impervious surfaces. So we're going to be comparing what's happening in the nature reserve sub-basin to the Lake Lieberman sub-basin, where one of our constructed wetlands is, compared to the campus culverts location, which is where we built that new wetlands in 2017. All right, so these are all the surface sampling sites in this part of the watershed. We've been monitoring water quality for over 10 years now. We're mostly interested in what happens when you put all that road salt on all these impervious surfaces. All right, so that's a surface water problem. That can also turn into a groundwater problem. So we're also fortunate on campus that we've been able to install some monitoring wells on our campus as well. And so we have a couple of wells that are located down here in the glacial outwash. Once again, this is the Susquehanna River. All right, so the Susquehanna River has moved across this floodplain, deposited some glacial outwash here. So these wells have a connection directly to the river. Also on campus, these red dots are typical aquifers in our part of the world. We have glacial till as a shallow aquifer, not a very good aquifer, but we have wells up in the nature reserve as well as wells on campus near what we call the Troll Bridge, which gets us from campus to the suburbs. You can see here the Strait and Fuller Hollow Creek, once again, where they built the suburbs. And then a blue dot on there, we actually have one well that we drilled down into the shale bedrock. A lot of people in our part of the world, including myself, our source of water is fractures in that shale bedrock. All right, so surface and groundwater monitoring going on for a long time. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of these structures then. All right, I'd always like to look at the historical photos, especially because this is a 1937 vintage aerial photo that showed Binghamton University, the campus used to be farmland. Not very good farmland, of course, in the southern tier, but they tried. Once again, this is Fuller Hollow Creek. You notice it had lots of nice bends and meanders. We a natural stream should. The next picture is actually 1965 vintage. Now you can see the suburbs being built, campus is building up, and then there's a natural gas pipeline that was built across campus that actually dammed the natural wet metals and perennial streams running through the nature preserve location and started the formation of pond complex that we now call the Harper Pond today. And then to the right would be the picture, present-day picture of what the Harper Pond complex looks like. I'm going to go back and talk about that for just a second, because it actually turns out that building the pipeline, as well as later beavers moving into the watershed, are actually what caused the nature preserve wetlands to form. So if I go back to the previous pictures for a second, just to get you oriented again. So the nature preserve is located in this relatively pristine sub-basin. And then this is the series of beaver dams that have been built on the property. Okay, so that is a quick look at the nature preserve. So the most unimpacted wetlands. Then we're going to take a look at the Lake Lieberman next, and then look at the campus culverts after that. All right, so here's Lake Lieberman. Okay, so the left-hand picture shows the old Lake Lieberman, about 2006 vintage. And we have these old dormitories on campus. And this is the structure. Once again, it's about the size of a football field for scale. And then this is the new version of the Lake Lieberman complex today. Okay, so back in 2006, I had a really smart master student. His name is John McCann, who's now a local watershed professional. He studied the discharge coming in and out of these wetlands, and it turns out this old wetlands function very well. So this is actually the inlet to the wetlands. This is the Lake Lieberman inlet. So this captures all the runoff from those impervious surfaces. Very fast response time. And then the wetlands is actually functioning very well. So it slows down the amount of discharge and eliminates the major peaks of discharge. So it's functioning very well as a wetlands back in 2006. Unfortunately, you can notice on this left-hand slide, there was actually filling of material, right? So this bathtub-shaped wetlands was being filled in with sediment. So you see this nice delta forming, so it's gradually filling up. And so it was reaching its storage capacity with sediment. Okay, so then the university decided they wanted to build a new dormitory complex. In order to do that, they had to expand the wetlands. And so this is going to be the new footprint for the wetlands in about 2015, right? So relatively recently, so they built these new dorms over the old footprint, and then they changed the style of the wetlands to a new style of wetlands. So in this case, what we have is we have this riprap line channel that actually has a weir located in it to monitor some of the discharge. And then we have this sediment catch basin on this location. And then we have this nice meander that goes through the wetlands to the outlet location. All right, so that was the new style of infrastructure design. It was actually working out pretty well. We'll take a look at that on the next slide. Here's some more recent photos of what it looks like. Okay, so this is actually a couple of photos from this summer. So Troy was talking about these large rain events. And so we wanted to mention that these wetland complexes on campus are used field sites in numerous courses. And these are actually some of our summer research immersion students. So it's a freshman research immersion program. So we have the freshmen out there this summer. I should call them first year students. And Bering here, she's actually showing the stage height that was measured by the sensor during a major storm in June. So this is actually a meter of flow that was coming across this riprap channel that was getting into that wetland. So it was basically about a 35-minute thunderstorm flowed across this impervious surface, pushed all this flow through the inlet structure that we monitored with the sensor. And then this is what the structure looked like after that rain event. So this is the storage capacity of this wetland. So we're looking now across this riprap channel into the wetlands itself. It's storing the water after that rain event. And so the way Lake Lieberman was designed was, it was designed to have 100-year storage capacity. That's where this hand is moving right on here. So it can capture 100-year storm events. And then the top of this outlet structure is the 10-year storage event potential. And to tell you the truth, it looks pretty well. This is about as full as I've ever seen this structure. So it looks like it might have actually been oversized, which is a good thing. And to tell you the truth, even during the summer, it responded very well. So captured the flow and then released it gradually. So far, so good. Okay. Now, the next part of this is going to be about what can you do with this sensor technology. So here we're going to incorporate the sensors. And so our sensors are used to monitor water quality and quantity. So they monitor stage, temperature, conductivity, install them at several sites. One was installed at the outlet of Lake Lieberman, and one was installed at the outlet of that campus culverts sub-basin before we built the new wetlands. And actually this slide convinced the administration that it would be a good idea to build this wetlands. So the idea would be, we have this road salt that's impacting our watershed. So this is conductivity on this y-axis here. And we notice that this is what's coming into the campus culverts location. So this is impervious surface runoff coming from all that salt. To tell you the truth, the conductivity levels here, this is about half as salty as seawater, believe it or not. So the water coming across campus during the winter back in 2017 was half the salinity of seawater, right? So unfortunately, that's putting a big slug of salty water right into the Fuller Hollow Creek, which is getting right into the Susquehanna River. So the idea about these stormwater retention structures then is you'd like to translate, you might say, this response to later slow it down and also decrease the conductivity response. So you want to take all that stormwater and move it and decrease the conductivity in this case. And so the administration liked the fact that it looked like this stormwater wetlands is working very well. And this was actually on the bottom of the slide. This was our proof of concept that resulted in the construction of the Bartle Wetlands, right? So that was a good thing. All right, so the Bartle Wetlands then. Okay, so this is our Bartle Drive green infrastructure. And this is kind of a during and an after photo, right? So this was built in 2017. And so the parking lot actually has some bioretention structures for the parking lot. And then we actually diverted a portion of the flow from the culvert system under Bartle Drive. So previously, all the parking lots on campus, especially on the western side of campus, all that impervious surface runoff got into an underwater culvert system. And when we built the Bartle Wetlands, we put a couple of structures in there to peel off some of that runoff and run it into these new wetlands. So this is what it looked like back in the summer of 2018, when we had a faculty and students and physical facilities staff were actually planting the wetlands. So the inlet's over here next to the softball field, and then it gradually runs through these storage basins and then it exits out of this location. So this is before we allowed water into the wetlands. So this is natural groundwater coming in. And then this is 3 years later. So this is what it looks like 3 years later. Yep. So we actually planted some shrubs, but to tell you the truth, a lot of the native vegetation has outcompeted the shrubs that we planted. That's probably a good thing. But this is the same kind of before and after picture, 2018 and 3 years later. All right, looks good. And then Troy was asking, well, how are the wetlands working? So I thought I'd show you one more illustration of that today. So let's take a look at the sensor data. Look at the storage potential from this structure. Okay, so these are going to be recent stage sensor results. This is just the height of the water. Bartle Inlet's going to be the top plot, and the Bartle Outlet's going to be the bottom plot. So I'm going to scroll up on this a little bit so I can take a look at my captions over here. All right, so this is the height of the water, and these are days. And so this is late August to early September of this year, so recent storm events. And this is the inlet structure. So we're getting all of this runoff, all this pulsed runoff coming from every little, you might say, drop of rain that gets on those impervious surfaces. Right, so that is the response at the inlet. That's actually the sediment catch basin pool where we have one of our sensors. And then the second plot is actually the outlet. All right, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to capture, slow down that flow. So it's doing a really good job slowing down the flow and then releasing it over a period of a couple of days. All right, so this is the outlet hydrograph, and it turns out during those main rain events in the summer, it's actually responded very well. Captures most of that runoff and it releases it over a period of a couple of days. So that's functioning as we had planned. So far, so good. Right, so it looks like we sized those pretty well too. Okay, we'll keep going. A couple more slides here today. And I was going to mention, so if you're kind of interested in this type of thing, we want to invite you to come to Binghamton University, check these out. So I want to talk about education and outreach for a couple of minutes here. All right, so now the Center for Integrated Watershed Studies, okay, we're actually preparing some virtual field trip guides. So you can actually come and visit our campus and take a look at some of these different locations on our campus. And so what you visited today, you visited a couple of the sites for our erosion and constructed wetlands trip. So we're going to have a couple of trips here, the erosion and constructed wetlands trip. So I authored part of this. And so you visited Lake Lieberman as well as the Bartle Wetlands today. But we also have other trips, what we call a humans and nature hike, a vernal pool hike, as well as an invasive species hike. So we're populating these different hikes, and the field trip guide will be active soon. So please check back visiting the wetlands. You're more than welcome to come take a look. So I'll let people at the USC know when this is up and available. All right, so now I'm going to finish up then here. Always have to have some acknowledgements. Some very exclusive acknowledgement, you might say. So I just want to thank, first of all, we've had lots of graduate students that have worked on this project. So John McCann was a physical hydrologist. You saw some of his plots today. He works locally. Miranda Kearney, she did a lot of work on the old Lake Lieberman wetlands, and she's one of our undergraduate instructors here at Binghamton University, did her PhD in biology. Megan Larson is actually our plant ecologist. She did a lot of work on the Lake Lieberman structure, and she looked at how the plants, well, you might say the native seed bank took over the wetlands, which was a good thing. John Schmickens is one of my grad students that is now the leader of the one of the freshman research immersion programs. Okay, Dylan Horvath is our nature preserve steward. This is actually a picture below us here of all the trails in the nature preserve. So Dylan keeps track of all these trails, what's happening in our nature preserve. Nick Corcoran is our person on campus. That's our landscape architect that helps design these structures. I want to mention Peter Neffer is our physical processes specialist in geological sciences. John Titus is one of our ecosystem ecologists, and many of you already know Wei Jing Zhu. He's also one of the former directors of CIWS. So I want to end today by looking at the bottom of this. All right, so you're more than welcome to come to BU. Take a look at these fall hikes. You can park at a couple different places across campus. And once again, just a reminder, here's once again, Fuller Hollow Creek. Straight as an arrow, not the way it's supposed to be. On the left-hand side, there's some parking places to take a look at the structures and stair park, some nice waterfalls over here, or you can get right into the campus network and walk along the trails and enjoy the beautiful fall colors, which are just starting to come. So they'll probably peak within about the next couple of days or so. Okay, so I'm going to stop there with the share, right? And then I guess I'm ready to take a few questions if anybody has anything. I think there was something in the chat room, but I can't
Yeah,
see
we've
the
got
chat.
a couple that have popped in so far in the chat. And folks, remember, feel free to put things in the Q&A, or as well as if you'd like to ask yourself, just put your hand up and I will call on you in order. So we'll start with our chat here, Joe.
Okay.
How could native wetland emergent plants survive being soaked in such salty runoff?
Yep. Well, to tell you the truth, that is an awesome question, because we are very concerned about that, because initially this started off as a freshwater system. And so the pictures there, you just saw that the wetlands, the taipa, have no problems with that salty water. So unfortunately, we have too much taipa in those wetlands. And we actually think, though, the native vegetation is actually doing better than we might have expected. Mostly because the new wetlands, the Bartle Wetlands, it looks like it's still functioning pretty well, that actually gets the salt content actually decreases during the summer. In other words, that wetlands is getting flushed out. So far, so good for the Bartle Wetlands. Unfortunately, the Lake Lieberman wetlands, the other larger wetlands we talked about, it turns out all of that impervious surface runoff, some does to get into the groundwater, and we're actually seeing some major problems with our shallow groundwater, right? So we have all this fragipan in our watersheds. It's all that salt just kind of rests on top of that fragipan. And so our shallow aquifers, especially in the glacial till, unfortunately on campus, they have fairly high baseline conductivity that keeps increasing every year. But still so far so good. So I think the plants are surviving pretty well. There's actually lots of amphibians yet. There's not too much of a fish population. I don't think they're handling the salt very well, let's put it that way. There used to be a few native species, you might say, of fish in Lake Lieberman, but they're not too happy with that salt in the system. So I hope that at least partially answered the question.
Thank you. Our next question is, after a summer like this, how are the new wetlands keeping the mosquitoes in check?
Oh, that is, I would say that is I would say the mosquitoes are horrible everywhere this summer. I'd say the wetlands are actually probably better than I'll call it the floodplains. To me, the floodplains along the Fuller Hollow Creek have been the worst place for mosquitoes this summer. That hasn't been as bad as I expected near the wetlands. When you get off into the forest adjacent to the wetlands, that's where I've actually had the most problems.
Okay. All right. Just keep rolling down the list here. Do the wetlands mitigate the salt runoff from impervious surfaces?
I would say the answer is partially yes, right? So unfortunately the road salt it would be a total dissolved solid, so there's not really any plant that's going to store too much of that salt. So the best we can do is have enough, you might say, groundwater coming into the wetlands, as well as mixing time in the wetlands. Now we can take some of the stormwater runoff. So usually, like when we apply salt to our campus in the wintertime, they kind of coat it first, and then the actual snowpack, when it melts, actually kind of dilutes that signature. So if we can store some of that salt in the wetlands and actually dilute it, I think that's actually where most of the mitigation is. We're not storing it in the plants, especially in the wintertime. It just kind of moves right on through, but actually slowing it down and mixing it with other water sources is helping lower the conductivity. So far, so good.
All right. And just sort of in the same kind of line there, how is the salt runoff not considered by New York as a point source or non-point source pollutant?
You know, to tell you the truth, I wish I knew the New York State regulations better. So I wish that somebody could help me out with that, because as far as I know at present, I don't think the salt is monitored as a pollutant. I could be totally wrong about that, right? So I don't think there's, as far as I know, the regulations are more about keeping the total dissolved solids in our drinking water below 500 milligrams per liter. That's the main thing that people are more concerned about. But I'm not sure if there's a real regulation on the book that talks about surface water runoff. I wish somebody could help me out with that, because I would like to know as well.
Okay. If anyone would like to jump in on that, just let us know. Now, we have a comment and question together. So this is from John. Nice work, Joe. I might need to stop by and take advantage of those self-guided field trips. You
Awesome.
showed that the new wetlands are working to knock down the flashing discharge, but have you been able to see any effect on the conductivity of the outlet from the new wetlands relative to the input?
Yep. So the answer would be yes. So it turns out the best thing about having that little catch basin on the front end, that's where the salty water starts. And then it flows over, like if I use my hand, flows over this little check dam into the larger structure. And so to tell you the truth, there's a little bit of groundwater getting in there. Actually, the softball fields are helping us out, because the drainage that's coming in from the softball fields is actually almost pure rainwater. So we're actually mixing in some pure rainwater with the impervious runoff that mixes together to get into the wetlands. And so actually we see that the conductivity at the outlet is always lower than in the inlet. And also, I was mentioning to Troy before we started the talk today, that actually the wintertime is actually a good time for a research project, because you can actually see slugs of salt moving through the wetlands. So you can actually calculate the storage time in the wetlands by looking at the road salt when it comes in and how quickly it leaves. So actually we're kind of using the salt as almost like a slug test to look at the storage capacity for the wetlands.
Fantastic. We have time, I think, for at least one more, and probably another if anyone has one, but this one left here is, have you observed a decrease in sediment buildup on the river delta since the wetlands were constructed?
Okay, so I'm going to say that I don't think that the wetlands on campus are helping us out too much with the major problem on Fuller Hollow Creek, because the major problem with Fuller Hollow Creek is actually coming out of the Stair Park and Murray Hill outlet sub-basins. So those are the larger sub-basins. And I'll call it the main place we see most of the erosion happening is actually right adjacent to Stair Park, which is the straightest part of the watershed with thickest glacial till. That's actually before we get to the campus part of the wetlands. And so they just installed actually a new bridge over the top of Washington Street, right over the top of that channel. And it's actually a really good time to see the glacial till and how quickly it's going to move. So unfortunately, those flashier parts of the stream are actually upstream from campus. And I actually, unfortunately, think that's where most of the base load is coming from. So as you enjoy your walk up at Stair Park and enjoy the waterfalls, there's actually really good locations up there. We can see the wrapped line channels to slow down the sediment, but you can also see the bedrock that's being exposed through the incision through all that glacial till. So unfortunately, there's going to have to be some more work done in the main channel to slow down or that bed load. We probably need some more bed load capture capacity farther down in the watershed. I think we're doing a pretty good job on campus. Nature Preserve is doing an awesome job, but unfortunately, there's other parts of the creek that are not as in good shape. I'll phrase it that way.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much, Joe. Those are the questions we have for today. So I'm just going to share my screen real quick to give everyone information about what is happening next week. So we're going to be looking at an overview of the Upper Susquehanna progress dashboard. So please join us. Oh, there was another question that snuck in on me. So I'll leave that up and I'll ask you over the screen here, Joe. Are there any big picture studies out there to try to calculate how the region can lower broad-based flooding risk in the Susquehanna River Valley if more of these constructed wetlands were constructed?
I think the short answer is, as far as I know, the answer is no, especially in the more urban environments. So I think that the whole idea about doing some of the stormwater capture capacity in urban areas is going to be a growing area. So there might be some people that are farther down the watershed, more towards the Baltimore area, that have done a lot of work on urban catch basins. I think we're a little bit behind them up here in upstate New York.
Right. Joe, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. Everyone had lots of great questions. We appreciate you joining us today. And thank you everybody for another great Watershed Wednesday. And hopefully we'll see you next week.
And I just had one last thing. Yep,
Sure.
please send me some questions. I'll try to find some answers. That's another thing. Or have my smart students find the answers for you.
Perfect. All right. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day.